Hey guys, it's Dr. Ivy Brandon here, naturopathic doctor. I'm doing another live interview and I'm really excited for the one that I'm doing today. If you missed our last live interview with Dr. Riva Prale, where we talked all about postpartum pelvic floor dysfunction and physical therapy, we have that recording live or available that you can watch after you watch this live. So I'm very excited to have someone who I was actually introduced to when I moved back to New York City back in 2011. So I have Caprice Abowitt. So she was introduced to me by a fellow yogi because Caprice had actually moved also to New York from Seattle around the same time, and our mutual friend said that we would get along. And I think that it speaks for itself. But anyway, so Caprice Abowitt is the director of education of Birthsmarter, which is a platform for unbiased, inclusive, and accessible childbirth education. She is a birth doula, childbirth educator, and certified yoga instructor, and that's pretty much how we got connected. She was a senior teacher at the Prenatal Yoga Center here in New York City and co-led their teacher training. As a former dancer, Caprice's approach to birthwork and education is from a functional movement perspective. It's another thing that really connects us is dance. After a decade of living in New York City, she moved back to her hometown of Phoenix, Arizona, where she lives with her husband and two sons. We have all the links to both birthsmarter.com, which is the childbirth education platform that Caprice is going to be talking about, and actually which I have used personally and have recommended to some of my patients, as well as her own individual links at Sage Caprice. So again, we were first introduced via a mutual yoga friend, and then interestingly enough, I had reached out to you because I can't remember, many years ago, I was doing a presentation on postpartum health, and I was like curious about placenta encapsulation, and you connected me to this doula who then many years later became my doula. And when I was going through the whole childbirth process, I wanted to take childbirth classes, and she recommended your classes. And then I was like, wait, I know Caprice. How is this even possible? So why don't we just kick it off first, just like, what got you to Birthsmarter? Because like you have this dance background, and I just find it's very fascinating. A lot of the people I interview have gone through many different little journeys before they got to where they're at.
Yeah. Well, first, thank you for having me. It's great to be here. Yeah, it is very funny. It's like a lot of iterations, in some ways of the same thing that has gotten me that got me to Birth Smarter, but everything sort of builds on itself. So as a professional dancer, I lived in Seattle, and was teaching yoga and dancing professionally. Um, and as I was getting ready to move to New York, I wanted to be dancing in New York. I wanted to be teaching in New York. My sister gave birth to my eldest nephew, and she had a fairly traumatic birth experience. And I remember, I mean, not long before I moved to New York City, lying in the bed with my sister a couple days after she had given birth. I flew down to Phoenix, and no one else was home, and it was just her and me and the baby. And she started crying, and she said, um, "No one told me how hard this was going to be."
Hmm.
And sister me was like, "What? If I had known, I would have told you. Oh my, I'm so sorry that I didn't know and I didn't have the facts." And so in my move to New York City was when I thought, well, next step for me, as a yoga teacher and getting more information for people who are having babies is becoming prenatal yoga certified. And so that was what led me to the Prenatal Yoga Center, where I stayed for about a decade and yeah, I co-led teacher training there. But it was in my, teaching of prenatal yoga where I was seeing, 50 or 75, prenatal folks a week. And when you're in front of that many people, folks start to ask you, like, well, would you come to my birth? Like, I would really like some birth support. And I was like, all right, well, I should probably, I should probably get on the next step there, which is becoming a doula. And I don't know that I really expected to fall in love with doula work the way that I did. But it was so significant to be there and to support folks in that time. So I was a fairly active birth doula in New York City, and in teaching a lot of prenatal yoga and a lot of prenatal yoga teachers, um, and attending lots of births. And I became a childbirth educator, but through a larger platform that has like a pretty standard, like, here's sort of the ingredients for, the way that, we sort of think about childbirth ed, and go make your own class or go, set up your own thing. And it's a shorter training. And so I did that, and because I was teaching so much, I really wasn't very interested in teaching group childbirth education. Um, Ashley, who is the founder of Birthsmarter, she and I had met a couple of times throughout the years in New York City, just in the birth world, and we reconnected through. There might still be around, but there was like a pelvic health study group, which was people from all that. It was like, pelvic health, uh, doctors of physical therapy, and, OTs, and childbirth educators, and doulas, and yoga teachers, people who were really interested in pelvic health and how we were incorporating that into, whatever else we were doing. And she and I reconnected through that study group, and she said, like, we should really collaborate, we should work on something. And as she sort of like slowly pulled me in to Birth Smarter, she said, you should really start teaching like full, like Birth Smarter classes. And I said, I don't want to. I don't want to do that. I'm very busy. I have a little baby. I don't want to do that right now. And she said, well, just come observe me. And I
Mm.
said, okay. And so I went and I watched her teach a class, and I was like, it's really different. Like, it's really, really, really different. The curriculum is really different. I do actually really, really, really wanna be doing this. So, she sort of, secretly pulled me in. We call it, like, a secret judo move, where
Mm.
she's like, you're like, "Wait, how did I end up here?" And that's how she kinda pulled me in. And I started teaching more regularly for her. And then as the organization grew, I took on the role of director of education. So now I do still teach expectant families, both virtually and in person. But I also train, our new Birthsmarter educators, and I support and manage our current educators across the US and in Canada. So yeah, it was a long and winding road to get there, but it was, I'm happy to be where I am now.
Yeah, one of the things that I also really like about Birthsmarter, because my practice is not just New York City based. I have patients from all over, and the fact that you have many different locations, but also you have a very strong online presence as well is really, really helpful for at least my patients. So I wanted to kind of like ask you more like, what exactly do you mean by unbiased childbirth education, and like how is that, why is that important as far as like birth smarter, and what makes it, I guess, like different from perhaps like other birthing classes?
Yeah. So when we say unbiased, we mean it in a lot of different ways, actually. So we often call ourselves, unbiased, inclusive, accessible. Unbiased really means there is no hierarchy of how to give birth.
Mm,
There is no hierarchy of this is the right way to give birth. And some of that comes from understanding, or, we utilize a framework to sort of explain that to our students. We explain that there's a physiological process, sort of like what can be universally true about birth itself, understanding the hormonal piece of birth, understanding the musculoskeletal piece of birth. But it's so fascinating to me that so much of childbirth ed focuses on that piece exclusively, like in a silo. It's
mm,
just about the physiological process, but that doesn't acknowledge that we aren't giving birth in a silo. No one is giving birth in a silo. So you can't focus exclusively on the physiology. You have to also understand the societal context. And so giving birth in a country with for-profit medicine, systemic racism, patriarchy, right, capitalism is obviously a part of for-profit medicine, um, and, additionally, in the societal context of understanding that, like, we're a more sedentary culture than our grandparents were, our great grandparents were, and that can influence parts of our birth experience. And overall, just knowing that, like, the cultural messaging that we've gotten around birth. What do we believe about birth based on what we've grown up hearing? That's different than it was for our grandparents or our great grandparents. And the third piece of the framework is that there's a personal context. People have personal circumstances that are influenced by physiological and societal factors, but we can't sort of control for everything. And so to say that everyone is supposed to have this type of birth or all folks should be giving birth like this, um, is really simplistic and frankly not real, and it doesn't take into account people's backgrounds, people's trauma history, people's own health in terms of what best serves them for their own birth experience. And so when we say unbiased, we mean coming back to this framework and allowing people to use that to work through what would be the right choice for our family? What would be the right choice for me? Right? And unbiased also means that not just in terms of, the birth choices, but unbiased in terms of who we're serving. Unbiased in terms of, right, like all families, all family structures, solo parent, like everyone is welcome and supported in a Birthsmarter class. And that means not just the type of birth that somebody is looking for, but also their family structures and systems in general.
yeah, I think that's really helpful, specifically, again, because sometimes someone might think, oh, if I'm taking a birthing class, then that means I'm not going to be using an epidural. Maybe it's going to have to be a home birth or at a birthing center. But what I really appreciate about Birthsmarter is that one, you cover pretty much almost any kind of type of birth, and so it's really is applicable for anyone. And maybe even talk a little bit more about, I guess, it kind of like the process, or what one might even expect. I did the I think it's like a whole weekend
Mhm.
of like what kind of like what one would encounter there.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, oh, like, to talk about what the weekend class is
Yeah,
like?
yeah, of
I
course.
think any so we have a couple different formats for childbirth ed. We offer the weekend is sort of what we started with. It's a like that's our signature class. And the weekend is a 2-day intensive. It's 5.5 hours each day. We have a 1 day that's like 6.5 hours. And then we offer a series where it's like 3 sort of weeknights in a row. And all of those are offered in person. The series is also offered live virtually, and then we have an on-demand version that's a little more similar in terms of the length of content or the breadth of content to our weekend course. But one thing that Birthsmarter does really differently the first 90 minutes of every Birthsmarter class in terms of childbirth education is the same. The content of the curriculum is the same. We don't change like the length of time. The first 90 minutes is where we go over what we refer to as the framework, which I just explained, and then what we call the three actions. And the three actions are our way of describing the process of birth, specifically the process of a vaginal birth, as opposed to a surgical birth, which we do cover in the weekend. But right, but when we're describing the three actions, we're talking about what is um, what is the same and what parents and families can focus on regardless of the sort of type of birth. So the three actions apply whether a person is at home in a birth center or at a hospital. The three actions apply whether a person is going into birth spontaneously or whether they're induced. The three actions apply whether a person is medicated or unmedicated. And so when you can think about what things are universal, you don't have to layer stuff on top of here's how birth usually goes. And then if it doesn't go like that, then you can think about these things. When we start with what's universal and what works for
Mm.
everyone, then people have a better framework for, okay, now I get how this applies if I am being induced. I get how this applies if I've decided to get an epidural. I get how this applies, and even how I can take the seeds of it if I'm going in for a surgical birth, right? It's not exactly the same, but what are the seeds or the pieces of that that work here? And it becomes much more open and much more accessible than simply saying the way most childbirth ed works, which is here's exactly what you should expect. And then if it doesn't go like that, you can think about all of these other things as though there's like a drop down box, right?
Right.
We took a left turn and so now it's not this, you know?
Because I feel
So
like that, right, yeah.
oh, I was just gonna say, so in the weekend, you know, that first 90 minutes is the same, and then we cover more of the, you know, the nitty-gritty, but taking that piece, the 3 actions, and then that leads into talking about, the positive feedback loop, which a lot of people in, you know, the childbirth world are really familiar with. But when folks can take that piece into the remainder of class, understanding more pieces of induction, of cesarean, of even like if they are going to a different place for birth, it's not a home birth, you know, the car ride, triage, you know, what are we taking from the processes, the 3 actions that we learned and applying to pain medication? So it's covering sort of all of the things that you really do need to know, pushing, right? Delivery of a baby, placenta, all of the things that you need to know, but um, having a real foundational understanding of the components in order to make that really work for everyone.
Now, could you, sorry, go over like exactly what the three actions are? Unless like that's proprietary, like you need to sign up for the class, which again, I highly recommend. You're going to get so much more by actually taking the class. But we're going over some of the overviews.
Yeah, I think I have permission to go over the 3 actions, so I'm gonna do it really fast. And hopefully I don't get dinged, and lose my job. I'm pretty sure it's okay.
Okay.
So the 3 actions, as coined by Ashley Brichter, of Birthsmarter, are, the 3 things that you need to have to get a baby from the inside to the outside for vaginal birth. The uterus has to contract, and the uterus contracts by way of oxytocin, which is a hormone. The cervix needs to soften in order to get out of the way. And the mechanism for that is prostaglandins, which are not a hormone, but hormone like. And then the baby has to rotate. The pelvis doesn't typically have dimensions that allow the baby to just sail right through. And so the baby needs to be able to rotate in order to find their way out. And the mechanism for understanding how a baby gets through the pelvis is movement. And so when you can understand those 3 pieces and the fact that Pressure from typically the baby's head produces prostaglandins, and prostaglandins break down the collagen of the cervix, make the cervix soft, stretchy, pliable. Then the cervix can get pulled out of the way, and then what happens, prostaglandin sends signal to the brain, make oxytocin. Oxytocin creates uterine contractions, which pushes the baby down, which puts more pressure, which creates more prostaglandins. More prostaglandins send the signal to the brain, more oxytocin, right? And it becomes that positive feedback loop as those things build and build. And then as the cervix is getting sort of pulled back, those muscle fibers are getting recruited to the top of the uterus and pushing the baby down with a thicker, stronger muscle at the top, right? The fundus. And so as the cervix gets out of the way, then you've got this big old muscle at the top. And so you're always working towards building the fundus.
Mm.
That's my like 2-minute description of something that typically takes us 90 minutes to explain. So it's like the very simplest version of that, but within sort of those three actions, we give really tangible partner responsibilities. I don't know if you remember those from class, but we give like a really solid 5 partner responsibilities. Um, Everyone deserves labor support. So, it's not necessarily romantic partner or co-parent always, although that's primarily who's showing up to class. But, we've certainly had lots of grandmas take on partner responsibilities and sisters take on partner responsibilities. And, there's all kinds of doulas, right, taking on partner responsibilities. But having those tangible ideas too helps reinforce the 3 actions and the feedback loop.
Yeah, I think that's helpful. And I guess on the other kind of little big part, and we had, discussed this a little bit offline as we were preparing for this conversation, stages of labor. So this I know is not part of the Birthsmarter curriculum. And maybe you could just say exactly what we're even talking about, stages of labor, and why Birthsmarter has chosen not to incorporate that.
Yeah, so stages of labor is the very typical way of describing the arc of how a vaginal birth happens. And one thing that we sort of came up with in conversation at Birth Smarter is stages of labor is in some ways designed for providers more than it's designed for people in labor. Um, and by that, I mean the stages of labor is a very linear, like textbook description that charts dilation versus time. And it says when you are dilating from this far to this far, you will likely experience these things over this average amount of time. When you're dilating from here to here, you'll more likely be like this. And it'll go over this period of time, and the contractions will be like that. It's a very linear, very textbook description of what for so many people is not linear and not textbook.
Mm.
And the fact of the matter is, dilation is only telling us what is in that moment. It is a way to measure something, and sometimes that measurement can give us useful tools about, decision making if we're being faced with decisions. But otherwise, it's not necessarily a very helpful tool when myself, basically every other teacher on our team, and every doula we've ever talked to is like, yeah, sometimes you get somebody who really like hits those benchmarks and they look exactly like the textbook. And almost always, not almost always, but I would say more than 50% of the time, I, I don't see that happen. I see people move through things really quickly. I went to a birth 2 or 3 weeks ago where, I mean, I don't know, 30 minutes before this baby got pushed out, this lady was going like this. So chill, just the most chill person I've ever seen in my life, like so casual.
You
That
mean she
doesn't
wasn't in
follow.
any pain, or like she was not experiencing control? Like, Or is
My
it
back
just
hurts. My back feels sore. That
what baby
right?
number was it?
And still, I've seen lots of people have a second baby and be very overwhelmed by sensation, right? Or need a lot of support or a lot of movement. And the thing is that not everyone's reaction to, the way their body moves through the arc of labor is going to be the same. And so giving dilation and time markers is so irrelevant for so many people
Mm,
because 5 centimeters dilated is not halfway through the birth experience. It's just not. It might have taken somebody a really long time to get there, and it might be a really short time after. I've gone to a number of births where in 45 minutes, somebody went from 2 to 10,
wow.
but it doesn't mean that they weren't in labor before that. And I think that's what's really missing from the stages of labor and why it's such a misnomer is because it tries to graph this thing that is really not graphable. So we'll often give folks maybe a sensation arc of like, hey, a lot of folks early in their birth experience tend to feel more like this. They might be more external. Then folks tend to go a little more internal, right? But not explaining it in a way that says it's going to hit all of these benchmarks and you're going to notice all of these things acknowledges that people will have different things happen in their bodies. People will go through birth in different lengths of time. First timers, second timers, fifth timers, it doesn't really matter. And then what is universally true for all people because a person who is, going through an induction or a person who's being augmented or a person who, is choosing pain medication might not have the exact sort of stages of labor arc as somebody else, but the three actions still apply and the things that they need to be focused on in order to get a baby from the inside to the outside are more relevant than trying to figure out, okay, I'm supposed to do this pose or like this movement because I'm in this stage of labor. I'm in this phase, which is something I hear a lot.
Mm.
People coming into class and being like, oh, well, what kind of movement am I supposed to do during this phase of my labor? What's working for you? What feels right? What feels good? And how do we help you build critical thinking and like a framework so that you can identify what's working for you and what's not?
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. And I mean, again, I remember like a lot of like, hands-on exercises with your partner and like, deciding like what felt good and what didn't. And specifically with my husband, with his upbringing, he was not really raised as far as like his parents like actively touching one another. And so he didn't have a lot of experience in that. And even though, with what ended up happening with our birth, it still gave him now some tools, just in life tools, when I need more support or comfort for other reasons. So now the other thing that I thought was really, and you talked about it, thinking critically. And there, one of the things with your birth class, like, you have a supportive workbook, and there is an acronym that is applied specifically in order to make critical decisions, and not just like, as an individual birthing person, but also birthing person with partner, and maybe kind of, see what the acronym is, and
Yeah.
how one can apply it, because I think
Yeah.
it's actually something that can be useful not even just with childbirth.
Well, and that it's so funny too that you are noting, Ivy, that your husband is like taking some of these tools into, right? That's sort of our whole point is like anything that you're gonna learn within a birth class, we want to be available to you after birth. Like it's not exclusive to this experience. solely. So any of our partner responsibilities, any of the like bigger sort of concepts that we're nodding to should have long term, like they should have longevity in terms of we call it like the pregnant opportunity of you're learning something now because it's right in front of you, right? Because it's about pregnancy, it's about birth. But what can you take into the future that's going to serve you in partnership if you're in partnership as a parent, right? And just as a human, what's going to feel good and really work for you and for your family. Um but having so the acronym BRAIN we teach in class, and that's not like a Birthsmarter proprietary idea. That's like a broad childbirth tool that I certainly learned in other trainings. I think the way we work through it is really lovely in terms of letting it land for students. But BRAIN basically stands for what are the benefits, what are the risks, what are the alternatives that we could try, what does my instinct or my intuition tell me, and then not now or no. So it could be like maybe I'm interested in doing that, but not right this moment, or I just want to say no altogether. And as you mentioned, it's a tool, like I bring that into the pediatrician every time I go.
Mhm.
Like, hey, what are the benefits of doing this thing? Hey, what are the risks of like running this test? Or, like it's it's a helpful tool for a lot of things and can be really, really wonderful to use either approaching birth if there's conversations coming up with a provider or conversations within birth about what other choices might be available, but we combine brain with our framework. And I think having both can be really, really helpful for folks in decision making because it is really great to go through okay, what are the benefits of this thing? What are the risks? What are the alternatives? It's also helpful to acknowledge the physiology, right? Which is in some ways talking about the benefits and the risks. Hey, like what are we really trying to achieve here in the physiological piece if this is being introduced? What is the societal context? Sometimes that means, well, we only have this medication available. We don't carry this one at this hospital because of the broader societal context. And that's not about individual providers, that's more about our system. Right? And so then understanding in some ways how providers can be more limited in what they might be able to offer. And so, right, what does that look like in terms of the choices that are available to you? And then again, personal circumstance. Is this and that again goes to like instinct or intuition, but is also just the aspect of in this moment that I am decision making, what what is best serving me personally or our family or my child that might be really different from somebody down the hall or my neighbor that lives above me or right like it's going to be different and so utilizing both of those frameworks I think gives us the biggest and the broadest picture to then be able to narrow in and say what's the next right choice for us.
Yeah, it's very helpful. And specifically, a tool like the BRAIN acronym, I feel also really helps to give the person more autonomy in the birthing process, specifically if it's not necessarily going in the direction in which they had envisioned for themselves. And I mean, I can speak personally that that was, my birth story, and I feel that that really just like helped me kind of like get into acceptance. And I actually really love my birth, and I had like a really great experience, even though it was the exact opposite of what I had thought. And even my husband thought it was like funny, like all the like the hypnobirthing and everything that I had read about, and that was not what happened, but it was still a beautiful birth nonetheless. And I guess like maybe just sort of to kind of, wrap things up a little bit, what would you say are like some areas that you would really want to see changed about childbirth education?
Yeah. Um, I I think I've in a lot of ways probably said this in since we started talking, but I would just really love to see a lot less binary thinking. I would love to see a lot less black and white. of this is the way it's supposed to go. And if it doesn't go that way, then yeah, that was wrong. Because that really hardcore binary thinking either leads to a lot of self blame
Mm,
for birth givers. People come out of their birth being like, "Oh, I must have done something wrong because my teacher told me that if I did X, Y, and Z, then birth would be like this." And that's sometimes just not how birth goes. And when we're trying to understand things in this like very arcane or archaic, you know, timeline, it just doesn't serve a lot of birthing folks. And I think that can lead to a lot of blame game, either individually or to individual providers. And so I think having more nuance and really thinking about birth more along a spectrum, and thinking about the ingredients that are actually applicable to birth means that folks, even if they have things go differently than they might have pictured, still feel supported and still feel like this was a really positive experience, right? When you're with folks who respect you, then you get to be in conversation as opposed to conflict. And I think that's a thing that childbirth ed can better set people up for.
mm.
Is how do you be, how can you be in conversation as opposed to in conflict with folks and with providers and with, you know, with supporters. So yeah, I mean, I would say overall, I'd love a lot less binary thinking, and I'd like to see a lot more what we refer to as good science. Like evidence based has gotten really buzzy,
Mhm.
and it's not inherently a bad term, but I think evidence based misses some of the other context. And so when we talk about good science and what we like to offer in class, it is taking the available data that we have, but data can be limited, and it's limited to who's asking the questions and which questions are being asked, and right, how, like, who's funding the questions. And it's not to say that those are inherently bad. We want more data, we want more studies, but it also doesn't necessarily take into consideration or context, that, you know, we also have like evolutionary biology to point to, right? What have humans in the past done, and how does that lead us to like sort of compare these things? Anecdotal evidence isn't gold standard, but it should be part of the consideration. What are we hearing from physicians, from midwives, from doulas in the field, in terms of what they're seeing and witnessing and experiencing? All of those pieces combined allow us to then move forward and go, okay, we are going to take the data and we're going to put it in a broader context in order to offer good science for people to make really sound decisions for their families.
Yeah, I think that's helpful. And I guess, like, you know, you had touched upon this. I think one of the hardest things with giving birth in general is that there is a lot of conflict between patient and provider. And that could be from, you know, your conventional OBGYN, midwife, and then I guess, you know, unfortunately sometimes, you know, the partner. And
Yeah.
how, like, I guess, like, you know, what do you how do you think we could even change that?
Well, I mean,
That's
there's a lot of answers to that question. You know, one of them is like restarting our system in a way that supports more midwives, and, you know, like looking to other systems that operate really, really well and have lower rates of maternal mortality and morbidity than we do, because we stand alone in the United States. And there are systems that work really well across the board globally that really support families in labor, that don't put it necessarily into a binary of everybody has to do this or nobody can do this. So I think the big things when we're operating within the system that we have, right? Because we can't individually go change the system that we're birthing within, or the system that people are choosing to divest from, because that both of those things happen in the United States. And I think what to keep in mind is when folks have the access or the ability to really choose a provider, choosing a provider early on, or at any point, I guess, in their prenatal experience, um, choosing a provider that they feel really respects them and is in conversation with them. And some of that can be done, in those first couple of visits, just acknowledging like, oh, how was I responded to as an individual? Um, did I feel like this provider was sort of like brushing me off,
Mhm.
or did I feel like they really answered my questions or, took time? And physicians are also in a really tough place, especially OBGYNs, in terms of the way their insurance system, and it really does put them in a tough spot. I don't know any OB that's like, well, I'd really like to spend less time with my patients. That's my
Right.
goal. I'm really looking to, brush people off. A lot of us really do want to spend a lot of time answering questions, and the system as it is now doesn't really allow for that always. But making sure that folks have the ability to find a good fit, in terms of their provider. And if that is harder for folks to access, either because of their insurance or their financial access, making sure that they have really, really good support, whether that's in partnership or with a doula or another family member, but making sure that then those partners have the tools to be able to be in great communication with providers, as opposed to, seeing everything as a battle. And I think when we lead things with a binary of this is good and this is bad, as opposed to saying, hey, there's a broad spectrum here, the binary leads to conflict. And it leads like right away to like, but I'm wrong and you're right. And all of us, providers, support people, birth givers, all of us can be thinking more along a spectrum in order to then be in more conversation, and get to where we need to go, which is really good support, and people feeling respected within their birth experience.
Yeah. And I think also the other, you know, again, back to like this idea of conflict, this and how Birthsmarter helps is, getting away from this idea that, like there's only one like holy grail of birth. And because one of the risk factors actually for postpartum depression are, traumatic birth. And yes, like, things definitely happen, but the more that we can kind of like take ourselves off the hook, that we are trying to, because and it never ends. Even after you've given birth, oh, I didn't breastfeed enough, or I didn't give my child, I gave my child plastic toys, or too many screens, and like the list can be endless.
Hmm.
Really unfair, the way that we might speak to ourselves. And again, it definitely can even start with the initial birth process. And when we don't have the quote unquote birth that we thought we should have, that at some level, I should have said no to this, or I should have done more of that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it really does. Oh, I love the way you said that, right? Like it really does allow us to speak more kindly to ourselves and understand the, the role that we play in the process, but also what's in our control and what's not within our control. And that the personal circumstance matters. And so we're not all going to want or need to do the same things.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Caprice, this has been fabulous. I'm so glad that you said yes. And I'm hoping that a lot of our viewers learned a lot. And of course, if you're watching the recording, hopefully you also learned some things. And of course, you can always post some comments or questions in the recording, where hopefully we can answer them then as well. And we will be sticking around later for a little bit of Q&A for people that want to ask more questions. Uh, Again, this is Caprice Abowitt of Birthsmarter, doula, childbirth educator. I'm also excited that we're having more birth related interviews in the future. So we were talking about the Prenatal Yoga Center. Well, we're actually going to be interviewing Deborah Flaschenberg October 16th. We're going to be talking all about prenatal yoga. And then November 6th, I'm going to be interviewing Tanya Wills, who is a midwife who only does at home it, births. So we're also hoping to get some preview questions for people who might be more interested in learning more about home birth. Of course, that's just one way to birth. Uh, Again, this is Dr. Ivy Brannon, naturopathic doctor, and we're looking forward to seeing you again soon.